how the night's going to run. So we are tonight gathered to remember a tragedy that occurred 84 years ago, known to most of us as Kristallnacht, the night of the broken glass, the night when Nazis began to attack Jewish businesses and synagogues, and didn't just break the glass, but really it was a pogrom. It was an attack against the Jewish community that was really seen by many people as the start of a new phase of the Nazi attack on the Jewish people. Now, tonight's program doesn't actually deal with that directly, but it does, we hope, provide some context and food for thought. So I'm going to introduce our three panelists in the order they'll appear, and then I'll tell you what the schedule for the rest of the evening is going to be. So Dr. Michael Nevins is a retired physician and a medical historian who in his mid-80s decided to emulate Ken Burns by producing a Holocaust documentary. And although Burns' film lasted more than 6 hours, what you're about to watch will only take about 15 minutes. And I suspect, or as he says, I suspect there might be a few other differences. Dr. Dalit Warshaw is a relatively new member of CSAIR. She joined the congregation in the summer, and she composed and played the background music for the video. She has a distinguished career that began at an early age, and she's performed her own compositions with some of the world's leading orchestras. She's a faculty member at Juilliard and at CUNY Brooklyn College. Dr. Michael Nevins' son, Rabbi Danny Nevins, not a formal part of the program, but I do want to welcome him. For many years, he led a large conservative congregation in Farmington Hills, Michigan. Then he was the dean of the Jewish Theological Seminary in New York, where he mentored our own Rabbi Katie Greenberg and was my boss in my teaching at JTS. And currently he serves as the head of school at the Gertrude Ock Academy in West Orange, New Jersey. He's not a formal part of the program, but hopefully he'll share some of his insights as well. And all of our speakers have connections to the synagogue. So as I told you, Dalit and her family recently moved to Riverdale and joined our congregation. And in 1949, Dr. Nevins, elder Dr. Nevins, had his bar mitzvah at the old Adif Israel on the Grand Concourse in the Bronx, and later went to high school at Fieldston, which is only a few blocks from our synagogue. And during his medical training, he and his family, including his then infant son, now Rabbi Danny, lived for 2 years just across the Henry Hudson Parkway from the shul. So we're welcoming back to the neighborhood both Dr. and Rabbi Dr. Nevins. And so I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Nevins, who will give a little bit of framing for the video. And then at the end of the video, Dalit will speak a little bit about the music, and then we'll have a time for open questions, reflections on the video itself, reflections on Kristallnacht. That's a way of really observing this night appropriately. So I'm now going to turn it over to Dr. Nevins.
Well, thank you, Rabbi Katz. I'll try my best to explain what, in fact, was like a 40-year backstory of this video in just a few minutes. The video, the title is rather unusual. The title of the video is Letter to Marc Chagall. And despite that rather unusual title, the film is really about the Holocaust. And no, we're not trying to emulate or compete with Schindler's List or Sophie's Choice in 15 minutes. But more of at the time of Kristallnacht, I was only 2.5 years old, so I was oblivious of world affairs, and fortunately our family wasn't directly affected by the impending war. But that was a very long time ago, so let's fast forward to 1976. I was 40 years old then, married, 3 young kids, practicing medicine in Bergen County, northern New Jersey. And about that time, I read a new novel written by Alex Haley that was titled Roots. And I suspect many in this audience also read that book. It described Haley's African-American family's history. And it was soon followed by a very popular television series by the same name. And soon millions of people, including me, began exploring their own family's roots. And I seem to recall that one day I suggested to my 3 children that it might be fun if they constructed a family tree, but they didn't seem to agree. And they said, well, if you think it'd be so much fun, then why don't you do it? And I thought about that a little bit, and I decided, well, maybe they were right. And so I did. I began with the family tree and then much more. I gathered information, interviewed people, and soon my focus switched away from family names and dates to more general Jewish history. And in particular, I focused on the tiny shtetl in Tsarist Russia, from where my paternal grandparents had immigrated to America during the 1890s. And it still is, located midway between Bialystok and Grodno. And back then, more than 75% of the populace was Jewish. Now it's still in the same place, but it's northeastern Poland. It's called Dąbrowa Białystok, and there are no Jews living anywhere near there. Now, the town's name was pronounced Dąbrowa, which meant oak forest. And coincidentally, at that time, when I became interested in genealogy, we were living in a section of Bergen County that also was called Oak Forest. So in 1982, 40 years ago, I self-published a Yiska book, a memorial book about that town. I distributed copies to family and landsmen, and also to various libraries and archives. And also it was picked up and reproduced in a Jewish genealogy website called Jewish Gen. And I felt that the project had been a mitzvah, but rarely thought about it again over the next 3 decades. So now let's fast forward again, this time to 2016, when one day I received an email from a high school teacher in Dąbrowa by the name of Dorota Budzinska, and she explained that she and her students had been researching their town's long-forgotten Jewish history, and now they were planning to hold a conference about what they'd learned. And Dorota seems to have read my Yiska book online, and she invited me to speak at that event. And how could one refuse such an invitation? So in May of 2016, I visited my grandparents' shtetl, accompanied by my second son, Teddy, and Danny's son, my grandson, Sam. And needless to say, it was a memorable trip. Before we left for Poland, I received a formal invitation from the town's mayor, which announced that the program's official title was to be a reading of ashes. Didn't mean anything to me. I Googled the words and discovered that they were the title of a collection of 25 poems, all on Holocaust themes, that had been written after the war by a now deceased Polish poet by the name of Jerzy Ficowski. And it wasn't easy to locate an English translation of this small book. In fact, it's the only English translation that exists. But when I finally did, I found that these stark poems condemned Nazi war crimes, and that one of them had a most curious title, which was Letter to Marc Chagall. Well, it turned out to be a heartrending story of two very young Polish children who were caught up in the chaos of the Holocaust. And then I learned that in 1960, the poet had mailed a French translation to the famous artist who was living then in Provence. And when he read it, Chagall decided to make 5 illustrative etchings. It took him nearly 10 years to finish the job. He had other huge projects on his mind, but in due time it was finished, and I was able to obtain copies. And those etchings are very, very, are hardly known. They certainly don't appear in standard art books of Chagall's prolific work. So then about 2 years ago, I decided to combine Ficowski's words with Chagall's pictures in order to introduce them to an English-speaking audience, such as tonight's. And I gathered a team of collaborators, including Dalit Warshaw, and the result is the short video that you're about to watch. I warn you, the subject matter is grim, but after all, it's a Holocaust poem, and this evening is Kristallnacht. And indeed, our purpose is really to stimulate thought and perhaps even inspire some action. So let's now watch the 16-minute video, and afterward you'll hear from Dalit, who composed and played the film's musical accompaniment. And after that, there'll be plenty of time for discussion led by Rabbi Katz. So thank you. I presume something is happening.
I think Mason is setting up the video.
Okay.
Jerzy Ficowski was an acclaimed Polish poet. As a teenager growing up during World War II, he joined the underground army and was imprisoned for several months by the Gestapo. After the war, he lamented, "I didn't manage to save a single life. I didn't know how to stop a single bullet." Years later, he wrote, "The suffering of Jewish people is my great guilt. The guilt of all those who survived. It's not my sin or my guilt in a literal sense, but I feel that if I was destined to survive, this means that I'm guilty." During the 1950s and 60s, Ficowski wrote many poems on themes related to the Holocaust. They were published in English translation only once in a collection titled A Reading of Ashes. One of these poems had a curious title, Letter to Marc Chagall. Jerzy Ficowski admired pictures of what he called Chagall's fairy tales. But after the war, those early pictures seemed transformed by events. As he wrote, in a way, these descended into an inhumane time, associating themselves with the ashes of the crematoria. Perhaps Ficowski thought that by incorporating Chagall's art in this poem, it might preserve a world that no longer existed. When Ficowski first began working on his letter, he complained that it just would not grow. He wished to reproduce the voices of those who lay in the earth, but no ordinary words could do justice to the immensity of Nazi crimes. But in 1947, a book with the title Children Accuse was published in Poland that contained transcripts of interviews with young survivors. And the simple words seemed so authentic that Ficowski decided to insert brief excerpts into the substance of several poems, including his letter to Marc Chagall. In 1960, the poet mailed a French translation of the poem to the artist. To Ficowski's surprise and delight, Chagall was inspired to create 5 illustrative etchings. In 1969, the pictures and poem were printed in Paris in a limited folio edition. These 5 etchings were quite unusual. They weren't colorful and dreamlike, but dark and nightmarish. Flames and corpses floated in the sky, not flowers and lovers. Indeed, in his vast body of work, Chagall rarely depicted images of violence or war. In the poem's opening verse, Ficowski appears to gently chide Chagall that he couldn't possibly appreciate the full catastrophe, since he had sat out most of the war in self-imposed exile in the United States.
What a pity, sir, you do not know rose gold, the saddest golden rose. She was only 7 when this war ended. I never saw her, but she does not take her eyes off me. Twice the snows have melted on them. 2,000 times death has come to the 6-year-old eyes of rose gold.
Brother went out in the night, drank water from a puddle and died. We buried him at night in the wood. Once, Uncle went out of the bunker and never came back. We stayed in hiding like this for 18 months till the Russians came. We could not walk at all, and even now we have weak legs. And Rose is always sad. She often cries and will not play with the children.
What a good thing, sir, you do not know rose gold. The bunch of lilacs the lovers lie in would go up in smoke. The green musician's fiddle would cut his throat. The graveyard gate would turn to dust or be overgrown with brick. Paint would char the canvases. For the last, most terrible cry is always only silence. What a pity, sir, you do not know Freitchik. His mother gave birth to him only just before the war. Now he wanted to be a herring, which has its own salt, or a fly, which is allowed to buzz. For he was allowed only a small existence. He dreamt behind the wardrobe of an onion. Well, how could he not cry from such dreams?
I sat behind the wardrobe, had no supper. When someone came, I sat nice and quiet. I was never even out in the sun. I covered myself up with a blanket, which was full of lice. I thought I would always be like this. They said they would travel to Czestochowa and leave me behind. I was just about to cry, but I thought, what of it? When they go away, I shall come out from behind the wardrobe.
What a good thing, sir, you do not know Freitchik, who played behind the wardrobe at being a cobweb. The little daughter sits in the green window. The samovar from Vitebsk hums down the years. The sleepy oil lamps smoke. From heaven the winged herring blesses the country fairs. Anyway, why believe in Freitchik? After all, Freitchik is not the Lord God.
And on a certain day, Mummy came and took me somewhere else to live, where I had to call Mummy Madam. Sometimes I would forget to call Mummy Madam, and then Mummy would get very annoyed, but it was so hard for me to get used to it, so difficult, that now and then I had to whisper in Mummy's ear a few times, Mummy, Mummy, Mummy. And I would ask, Mummy, but when the war is over, will I be able to call you Mummy out loud?
These are verses from the Newest Testament. In it 6 million pages, charred, while those that survived have for years reflected a red candlestick of fire. And there are also testimonies of things. In the hairdresser's mirror, a bearded terror stirred up rings wider and wider still, as in sad green water, and they shattered that other world. Not even a reflection was left. I would send you, Mr. Chagall, albeit a small shard of the mirror, but by now they are deep in the stratum of a dead era, and near them an abundance of bones to which it means a lot that one should be briefly silent for them, lying in all the unknown places, and should recite for them aloud the word Mama.
The child was very frightened of death. It was snuggling up to its mother and asking, "Mummy, does death hurt very much?" The mother was crying and saying, "No, only for a moment." And that was how they shot them.
And now deserts arose. The sands of Majdanek, Sobibor, the dunes of Treblinka and Belzec, where the wind arranges for eternal rest, not flint, mica, sandstone, minced in the grinders of ancient seas, but limestone and coal of the human race, leveled with the earth. I, a man, I, a son of this earth, I, their unburnt brother, still see you, sir, your cockerel, now blind, guarding the scraps of human affairs, and on the last day of destruction, rising above the ashes. On the sites of the extermination camps, robber bands are prowling, looking for gold in the layers of ash left from the burnt prisoners. In the darkness, the ashes run out through the colanders of hourglasses, and in the air there seems to be a breathing of last gasps. Sometimes the night will be lit by a star resurrected from beneath the earth, a gold tooth extracted from the ashes. And then in that flash can be seen anthropoid hands dripping red. Today I recognize those palms, though by day they are as clean as a wafer. They applauded the trains in which Rose Gold and Freitchik from behind the wardrobe traveled, parting from us forever, leaving their dead behind them. I think they will find shelter and that I shall meet them again, tucked away in the safety of your prophetic colors, Mr. Chagall.
Marc Chagall never explained why he chose to illustrate this grim poem. Perhaps he too suffered from survivor's guilt. Indeed, after returning to France, Chagall composed an homage to dozens of Jewish painters who had perished. That tribute was called "For the Slaughtered Artists." And in one stanza, he appeared to be in a mood that suggested remorse. Did I know them all? Did I visit their atelier? Now I go to their unknown grave. They call me. They pull me into their grave. Me, the innocent, the guilty. They ask me, "Where were you?" I fled. Jerzy Ficowski's poem evoked grisly images of death camps and human ashes fallen to earth. We can only speculate about the meaning of the last lines. I think they will find shelter and that I shall meet them again, tucked away in the safety of your prophetic colors, Mr. Chagall. 6 years later, Ficowski added a postscript to the poem which he called Genesis, and once again Chagall's colors were mentioned in the final stanza. And the morning was the first day, and your colors, sir, were fulfilled, and even I in the north warmed my hands before them. And that's how the postscript ended. We are left distraught and devastated. And yet there is a sense of hope. This metaphor of hands warmed by Chagall's vivid colors at the dawn of a new day, the first day, Genesis, a time to begin again. Polish critics praised Ficowski's poems as being the most moving depictions of the Holocaust ever written by a non-Jew, and yet today they are hardly known outside of Poland. Perhaps this video may help remedy the lapse by making Ficowski's stark poem accessible for English listeners. Paired with Chagall's etchings, this synergy may provide a fresh way for us to think about the Holocaust. Both of these men were haunted by their impotence in preventing the slaughter, but with this collaboration they could express their anguish and anger. Indeed, this fusion of words and images generated emotions that neither could produce on their own. These two gifted men couldn't erase the Holocaust from their memories, and neither should we.
No, thank you. I just want to let the film and the messages of the film and the many images sink in for a second. And then I'd like to call on Dalit to share some reflections on the music that you composed and performed and what that process was like for you, and really for you, what was the film about?
Absolutely. I'm currently still in the process of being stunned by this really, really powerful film. And I mean, the music that I wrote, these pieces were complete before the film was conceived. So I myself am experiencing my music in sort of an incidental capacity and telling a story that is so pertinent to my initial conception of the music, but that it sort of acquired a new identity, which is as surprising or new or fresh to me as it might be to all of you. So it's really beautiful how just with the direction and the editing, how all of that was superimposed. From my end, I mean, for many years, I felt as a Jewish composer and as the offspring of an Israeli mother who had family from Poland who perished, I felt it was my obligation to narrate in music the stories that I knew and stories of others, but also to try to at least emotionally understand the stories I never that vanished just due to so many being erased. And so the first piece, the piece that is for solo piano that you hear in the earlier and latest part of the film, it's a piano work that's actually pretty early. It's entitled For Saba and Forgotten Souls, referring to my grandfather who had died when I was very young, and his siblings and parents, and so many more family members that we really did not know much about, who just their memories perished. And so I was striving to convey that message. And something actually a really powerful experience I had a number of years ago. I mean, the year 2016 was mentioned in another context here by Dr. Nevins. In my case, in 2016, I embarked on a concert tour in Poland to perform some of my solo music. And what I decided to do was to deliberately perform my Jewish themed piano music. I mean, I have music of all, based on all sorts of extra musical themes, and much of it has nothing to do with Jewish history. But in this case, I wanted to know what it felt like to be a Jewish composer and performer standing in a concert hall, not in a Jewish context at all, not in the sort of safe confines of New York, where of course everyone is receptive and friendly, and to tell the audience that I'm a Jewish composer. My family is of Polish Jewish background, and I am playing such and such music. And I played these pieces, including the piano work that you heard in this film in Łódź in Warsaw, at Polin, the Museum of Polish Jewish History, and then in Wrocław. And the responses were different in each place. It was an incredibly powerful experience for me. And at Polin, I discovered so much more about my own family at their research center, which was just completely, I mean, it was overwhelming, and actually prompted more music. A new work of mine will be premiered in January at Barge Music in New York. I could go on and on. The second piece that you heard, which involved instruments other than the piano, in case you were wondering what on earth you were hearing, it was not a violin, it was not a voice. These were theremins. That's a subject of another lecture. It would take probably an hour to sufficiently describe what these instruments are, but the theremin basically was one of the earliest electronic musical instruments ever invented. You basically kind of are seizing the pitches from the air. It operates with an electromagnetic field, and any object that goes within the field affects pitch and volume. And so what I was doing is I was recording myself on piano, then theremin number 2, and then theremin number 1, sort of creating a trio of my own playing on 3 different instruments via overdubbing. So that's what I was doing there.
Wow, thank you. Thanks for the explanation. So I want to encourage people. A lot of people have written lovely things in the chat about the film and the music, and so I'd encourage people to write questions in the chat as well. I'll start with a couple of questions, but then I'd love to be able to funnel some of your questions. I think I'd like to start, Dr. Nevins, just with a basic question for people who are not experts in film. You talked about inspired by Ken Burns. So could you talk a little bit about what the Ken Burns effect is here, how that's working? Like what that is for people who are not people who are experts.
Well, I am hardly an expert. My expertise was in finding collaborators who knew what they were doing. This was my first and probably last venture into filmmaking. So I was a complete novice. But in addition to discovering Dalit through her father, a neighbor, the whole film, my team of collaborators were all from my neighborhood in Rockland County. Friends were actors, and I had a marvelous producer, a cinematographer and producer. And I don't think we were, that was meant to be humorous, my allusion to Ken Burns, but or for that matter to Steven Spielberg. I have no such illusions, but it was really, I wrote the material, gathered the team, and I think one of the the pleasures of the whole project was the collaboration, working with others in a team. And as I say, most of the production is attributable to my colleague Vera Arano.
Thank you.
Yeah.
One of the points the film makes is that that Ficowski makes is that Chagall's art changed valence after the war, right? What he was doing before the war, depicting, his memories of his shtetl, feel very different, after the war when those shtetl disappeared. And I'm wondering for you, as you look at Chagall's art and Ficowski's poems, how do you think time has changed, or has it changed the valence of either of those? In other words, do you look at Chagall's art differently now after this project, or even Ficowski's poem? How does it age for you? How does it look from this point in history for you?
Well, both were enigmatic. Both Ficowski, when he had the opportunity to write about how he did the poem, when it came to what did it mean, he, like many artists, deferred and said, well, that's for the audience to decide. So he wasn't much help. Chagall also never specifically explained why he was inspired to do this, but as you suggest, it was a combination. These etchings, they're not his best work, and it's certainly not. You recognize some of the images, but certainly lacks the color and the mysticism of Chagall's paintings that everybody is familiar with. It seemed to me that what affected him were two things. One, the memories of Vitebsk, the Russian town where he grew up, where there were pogroms. And in fact, Chagall was very prolific. I read somewhere that he had made 10,000 works of art of various types, which sounds fantastic. But when I explored them, there were only, you could count on one hand the number that were graphic representations of war or death. And so these were, as I say, were idiosyncratic of his genre. And so obviously that poem, which came as a surprise to him, it jolted some memories. And as I explained in the film, some of those memories were a guilt feeling that he came to the United States for several years during the war, and to use his own words, he fled, whereas his artist colleagues, especially in France, had been killed. So, I've thought a great deal about what motivated Ficowski and also Chagall, and I'm still wrestling with that. I think that we all have to come to our own conclusions.
So Judy Baumel asked, Dalit, thank you for the music. Can you talk about the way the theremin speaks to the otherworldly experience or the emotions of Ficowski and his response to history?
Well, I would, part of me wants to kind of put the question back, back at you and say, how did it inspire for you emotions connected to this story? I could say actually, in the case of the theremin's history, it's a Russian instrument. The inventor was not Jewish, Lev Termen. He invented the instrument in 1919. The thereminist who became his muse and who was my mentor, Clara Rockmore, she was Jewish, and she was born in Lithuania. And the theremin that I played two different instruments on this recording, but the one that sounded most string-like perhaps is actually her theremin that was customized for her by the inventor in 1932. And when she would play the instrument, there was something, it really did speak a Jewish soul. I mean, her own history, she was from Lithuania, then moved to St. Petersburg, then emigrated from there to New York, where she spent most of her life. But when she plays pieces like actually pieces by Bloch, for example, the theremin sounds like such a Jewish instrument. And I think there's a lot of promise actually in playing more Jewish themed music, or in my case, writing more Jewish themed instrument for the music for the instrument. I hope it seemed to me that it was very appropriate in this particular context, and I actually really appreciated how the moment you're going into Ficowski's work, that's when the theremin starts being heard. I could say also the name of this particular piece that you heard is entitled Nizkora, which is in memory for in this case, Clara, my mentor, and there are multiple meanings to the title.
Dalit, could you tell us something about the narrative of your great-grandfather, which plays into your coming concert at Barge Music?
Sure, absolutely. So there, you know, I'm sure many of you are aware of an attitude that many Israelis would have in relation to the previous generation who either had perished in the Holocaust or those who had survived. The custom was, at least in my family, not to ask stories, to just keep going forward. And as a result, in my family, a lot of these stories were a lot of very real information about these people was just lost. But there was one story that was passed on about my great-grandfather. Apparently, he was a leader in his community in Dubienka. He was very, very literary, also a great swimmer. He had 3 sons, one of whom was, actually, sorry, 4 sons, 3 of whom were Zionists, and they emigrated before the Nazi conquest of Poland. 2 other children remained in Poland with him. When I think it was around 1939 or so, when my great-grandfather, he had a premonition that he would never see his 3 sons again. He swam across the river Bug from Dubienka all the way across the border to the Ukraine, which was then under Soviet rule, so not under the Nazi regime. Once there, he mailed a letter of farewell to his 3 sons in what was British Palestine at the time. After that, he could have stayed free. He could have stayed in the Ukraine. But instead, he swam back across the river, back to Dubienka to be with his family. Once he was there, apparently he was made an example of. He was beaten by the Germans, and because he was very outspoken, and they all died in Sobibor. And so the piece that I wrote is entitled "Swimming Toward Fire," and it's in 4 parts, and it explores what was going on, what might have been going on in my great-grandfather's mind, and heart as he was physically undertaking that journey across the river, swimming across the river. It must have been so cold. It must have been so scary. It was dark. It was, I can't imagine the feelings, converging feelings, also feelings of ecstatic love of life and hope and resilience, and a willing to take his own fate into his own hands. In his decision to return back to Poland to be with his family, I think that's, to me, that's extraordinary. So that's what I attempt to convey in my music, and it'll be premiered at Barge Music in January 8th, I believe.
You know, that story picks up on a theme that I was thinking about as I watched the film, the theme of knowing, right? That Chagall could not know when he was doing his earlier works what would happen to those towns and those people in those towns. And then Ficowski's, one of his critiques or his charge to Chagall over and over again is, what a pity you did not know Rose Gold, what a pity you did not know the young man. And so the theme of what we can know when, both either beforehand, what Chagall didn't know when he was making his art, and then after the Shoah, that he didn't, you know, the claim is that he didn't even know these characters, when in a way he did, because that was the world that he came from, even if he didn't know these people. But I think it's a larger argument about, you know, like you said, a kind of accusation of Chagall that he wasn't there and he couldn't know the experience during the war. And I guess and tying all that together with Kristallnacht, right? At the time of Kristallnacht, nobody knew that it was Kristallnacht. I mean, they knew that something bad was happening, but nobody knew how it would be part of an awful history. You know, nobody could have said it was the beginning of, because the thing hadn't happened yet. So I guess I'm wondering from, you know, either the two of you or Rabbi Nevins, you know, how do you think this theme of knowing plays into how we react to history and how we live in history, both sort of how we think about it, but also how we react to it?
Well, if I could say, I'm first of all deeply moved by my father's work and by Dalit's remarkable music, and also want to recognize my friend and your congregant, Dr. Barbara Mann, who's on this Zoom, and was just commenting about the sort of, not knowledge perhaps, but premonition that many of the Yiddish writers and artists had before the Shoah, maybe not knowing what was going to happen in terms of death camps, but having a sense of an end of their form of Judaism and Jewish civilization. I don't know if Barbara wants to speak. She's texting, posting very beautifully. Barbara?
Yeah, I agree. Mason, can we unmute Barbara and maybe Judy, and either of them can speak a little bit?
Well, oh, there she goes.
I can't. I don't have strong enough internet to put my video on. Thank you for showcasing this beautiful evening. I'm actually out of town, and so it's just really nice to be back in New York with everyone. And it's a really special evening and a special group of individuals. I was just thinking that, you know, the question of Chagall's nostalgia, you know, is just fascinating to me, you know, because it's layered in a couple of or 2 or 3 generations since. And I think Chagall was nostalgic himself already in 1916 for Vitebsk of 1908. So, you know, there's just so many, it's like almost this big telescope opening up, you know, and so there are paintings of his in the 30s, very few, but that White Crucifixion comes to mind as a painting that's very dark about pogroms in, you know, and using some of the imagery from those etchings that you showed, like sort of a little bit of that darkness and violence and fire. But, you know, I just, what I wrote in the chat, I'll just sort of underline it, you know, that there was I think the title of Weinleger's book is something like, the Shoah before Hitler or something like that, the Holocaust. This was happening, these in the civil war in the Ukraine, and there was a lot of anti-Jewish violence for many, many decades in that part of the world. And so, and Yiddish writers, again, were very pessimistic about the future. So Chagall in some of his paintings has this kind of lightness to him, but I can't believe that he wasn't aware, of what was happening, and it's interesting to think that that poem might have sort of triggered him in some way. That the book about the slaughtered artists, which is also a really interesting book. Anyway, I'll be quiet. Thank you again for such a great evening.
Say something.
I'm sorry.
Sorry. Oh, please go ahead.
I also can't use my video, but I think Ficowski's work on Bruno Schulz, the painter and writer, is really important here because Schulz is yet another generation later his work spoke so directly to the Jewish experience during the war. And I think his awareness of what was going on, I mean, literally he was shot as, you shot my, the Nazis, you shot my Jew and I'll shoot your Jew. It's an incredible story. And I think what's fascinating about this documentary is its sense of Ficowski's sensitivity to Jewish life as adjacent to his life. And I just would love to hear you talk about that a little more.
Could I comment? These poems were written over a short period of time in the 60s, after or even as early as in the late 50s. But Ficowski is best known, as was just mentioned, as being the biographer of Bruno Schulz, which again is a subject for another hour, I suppose. But also, he was not only sensitive, incidentally, he translated Yiddish poetry, among other languages, but he was particularly sensitive to the plight of the Roma, of the Gypsies, who also were horrendously destroyed during the Holocaust. Mason, could you put up that photo at this point of the tree? I don't know if he's there.
Yes, give me 1 second. I'm happy to share.
Yeah, if Rabbi Katz, if you don't mind, I'd like to just make another point. Some of you may have noticed the very last image of the video was of an oak tree, and that tree, that was a painting that was made by my friend and colleague, Dr. Marc Chagall, dermatologist in New York, who's a world-renowned artist. And I knew that Mark's mother had come from the same shtetl as my grandparents. I think she came out around 1921 or 22. And Mark, because I invited him to join us on the trip in 2016, and he came, and he was so inspired by his visit to his family shtetl that he made, within months of returning home, he made 18 colored prints, which were published in a book and exhibited throughout the United States, Europe, and Israel. And that wasn't enough. And so about 2 years ago, he painted this picture of an oak tree. You remember I said earlier that Dombrava, our shtetl, our family shtetl, meant oak forest. And so this is a Dombrava oak tree. And if you look closely, the Yiddish alphabet is represented amongst the trees. And the little red houses below are the town's burned houses. And I decided to put it at the end of this rather somber video to have this bright image, because to me, it's a positive symbol of life and strength and growth and hope. So in effect, it's a tree of life. And what's interesting is that this month, at several towns in northeastern Poland, they are memorializing, not celebrating, the 80th anniversary of Operation Reinhardt, which is the Nazi decision to implement the genocide. And so these towns are remembering their former Jewish neighbors. And at our family shtetl in Dumbrava, a mural of this painting has been placed on the outer wall of the high school for all to see. And so, in fact, in 2 weeks from today, at that shtetl, this mural and my video will be shown as part of their memorialization of the former Jewish neighbors. So it kind of, all of this, it seems to me, is a rather positive recent development. All is not dismal and depressing, and there's some splendid Poles, Jews and non-Jews, who are doing their best to recall their former neighbors.
Thank you for bringing that image. I think before you showed the image, what I was thinking about was, just what he spoke about and what you spoke about, the impotence of both Chagall and Ficowski, and what it's like at this moment to be a Jew in the world, and seeing rising anti-Semitism, and to be a human in the world and seeing rising hate in different places, and from different coming at us from all angles. And there's something both very chilling about the documentary, and like you said, the sense that both of them had, that there was nothing to really be done, and also like you said, very hopeful about the the ultimate response of art to these things. And and I think also really trying to inspire us to respond to what we see, and to not just let it slip by. I think programs like this, it's easier to sort of intellectualize and to go into our heads about the Shoah and about different things going on. And I think one of the things that your commentary on the poem and on Chagall's work asks us to do is not to just be in our heads, to really be active and respond in some way, and protest and push back and educate and create wider community. Last week I was in Israel, as people in my congregation know, as part of a delegation of Bronx rabbis and politicians and people who work in the community, running community centers and different sorts of organizations that just support people in the Bronx. And we visited Yad Vashem, and it was really interesting seeing Yad Vashem through the eyes of people for whom Yad Vashem is not their personal story, and just really watching them very quickly universalize this, but both appreciate the particularity of the story, but also sort of see themselves in that story. And over again, people talked about the need for people to respond and to push back and to create coalitions of the good against people who would not think good things. So it was just really, it was powerful watching the film for me at this moment. I'm gonna invite people, if you haven't asked your questions, this is your chance to ask it in the chat. And then, but I just want to ask maybe if the panelists could just go and offer some last thoughts as I'm seeing whether there's any last questions. So maybe Rabbi Nevins, if you want to start as you can either speak as Rabbi Nevins or as the head of school at the Goldock Academy, or as the son of the filmmaker.
Thanks, Rabbi Katz. And thank you for hosting this wonderful program. I think the thing that remains with me is this issue of survivor's guilt, and how Ficowski addresses Marc Chagall as an equal, and in some ways, we often speak these days about what's your position, what's your ownership of this tragedy, you know, and we might think, well, the Jewish artist Chagall has more ownership over the representation of the suffering of the Holocaust than the non-Jewish poet Ficowski, and yet Ficowski lived through that period. He lived through that war. He he saw the people as they were dying, and which Chagall didn't up in upstate New York. And it's interesting to me because today it seems our culture has regressed in many ways, where you're not allowed to sort of to speak to an experience unless you yourself can claim to some kind of ownership of that experience. And so one thing that I'm really taken by is these two artists each saying, of course, I'm not a victim of the Holocaust, but I am sort of required, I'm morally obligated to engage with the subject material in a serious way and to honor the suffering and the memory of those who died. So, you know, that's one takeaway from me. And then the second is really, and what about us? You know, like, here we are all these years later, and, you know, we've chosen to spend our Wednesday evening not obsessing about electoral returns, but which we could do, but instead to focus on a calamity of nearly a century ago now, and to wonder about what is our, you know, I wouldn't use the word guilt, because if my dad was, okay, he was 2 years old, that's great. And some of us might have been a little older, some of us definitely weren't here yet. But what is our moral obligation towards these people, and what is our obligation to find new ways of telling the story? And that's what I'm so moved by with this project, is how you found a new way to tell this story and to deepen our emotional engagement with it. So that's what I wanted to share.
Thank you. Dalit?
Well, this also harkens back to what you said just a bit ago about artists sharing their premonitions in their various ways. And, you know, I think of like an artist, for example, like Charlotte Salomon, who was a really gifted young Jewish painter from Berlin, who found herself in hiding from the Nazis with her grandparents, and in order to fight back, or just to maintain a sense of life, which is a way of fighting back and a way of making a stand. You know, she created an extraordinary breadth of artwork, 769 canvases that were an autobiography, and that included poetry and music, and I mean, it's an astounding work. Irene Nemirovsky, a writer from that time as well, who had such insight and you know, eyes about what was happening, even, as you said, even though no one was aware of the death camps, you know, specifically, or and as artists or as people now, you know, how to respond. I mean, in my own way, I feel premonition sort of intensely. I don't know if we carry it in our heredity, if it's genetic or something, but I mean, to respond through doing and conveying and imprinting our sense of life and soul in whatever way we can do. And in my case, it's music, but to tell the story.
You know, if I might, you know, I ended the video with kind of a challenge to the audience to do more than just be moved, but to actually do something. So the poet, he responded, he expressed his frustrations in verse, and Chagall regretted his own inaction and chose to illustrate the poem. And the school teacher in Poland teaches her students about their country's history, and also encourages them to clean and restore Jewish cemeteries. And Dalit composes music, and Marc Chagall, creates paintings and murals. But the important thing is that whatever our talents are, that we respond in some way. Danny used the term engagement. And I think it's important to build bridges. One way is to visit, because it's not just to visit and visit the concentration camps and death camps, but to speak to people and to hear their narratives. That's what Dalit did when she went to Warsaw. She learned stories about her own family, and that inspired her to be creative. Right now, this past couple of weeks, I've invited my 17-year-old granddaughter to become a pen pal with one of the students in the high school in Dumbrava, and they've started to communicate. And I can only hope that good things will come from that over time. So I think it's very gratifying that people are inspired and moved by this video, but be much more important, I think, if everyone in their own way did something to try to correct the injustice of the past and to move us all forward.
Thank you. That's I think the perfect charge for Kristallnacht. We're honestly one of the very few synagogues that have every year a Kristallnacht program. It's very rare. I was actually pleasantly surprised at JTS today at the end of Mincha. I was there teaching at the end of Mincha. They asked if anyone had any announcements. Some students talked about different things going on. And then one of the students, Giselle Baylor, raised her hand and said, I just want to say that today is the 84th anniversary of Kristallnacht. And I was gratified to hear that brought up at JTS. And I wish that they could have heard you, Dr. Nevins, talking about it's good to know that it happened. And, as you said, art is a really powerful response. And I think what this program does for me, and I hope what it does for everybody who is part of it tonight, is to say, okay, what are you going to do? What are you going to do on this 9th day of the month of November? How are you going to respond to this day, the tragedies that Kristallnacht represented, both ones going back and for sure going forwards, and where we are right now in our world? And I think, as you said, there are things that each one of us has in us, whether it's the ability for political action or reaching out to a neighbor and talking about what happened, or being artists or being people involved in, in fighting hatred and anti-Semitism in different ways. We really all have a lot of work to do. So if the program leaves everybody thinking, okay, like what could I do in the next 24 hours before we're 24 hours past this commemoration, I think it will have been really powerful. At our synagogue, when we have these programs in person, we would always end with the greeting of simchas, that we should come together for happy occasions, we should come together for good things. I want to thank the panelists, and I want to thank everybody for taking time both to remember and to commit ourselves to action. Simchas.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I feel we should all stand up and sing.
That's very hard to do on Zoom.
Yes.
All right. Okay. I hope it's a good night, everybody.
Good night. Good night.